Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Helping KinCare Families Cope with Ambiguous Loss and Self-Care for Providers. We are so fortunate today to have with us Deborah Langosh, who is a licensed clinical social worker, a trainer, a consultant, and a psychotherapist from Brooklyn, New York, who has a tremendous amount of experience working with all different kinds of children and families, including children and families who find themselves in kinship care arrangements. And we are really glad that you all decided to join us today and learn a little bit from Deborah about, based on her experience. And we'll also have time at the end of webinar to listen to your questions as well and respond to some of those. You've been joined to the webinar today in listen-only mode. We have quite a few participants, but we really want to hear from you. So if you would like to chat your questions in throughout the webinar, we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. The way that you do that is to hover over the bottom of your screen and click on the blue speech bubble icon. That will open a chat box to your right, and you will be able to chat to all panelists with any questions that you have throughout the webinar. If you have technical questions, please also chat in, and our host, Fung, will help you sort those things out. So the webinar will eventually be posted within a couple of days to our CTAC website, and that will include the recording, the slides, and links to any resources that are shared during the webinar today. You will see in your chat box shortly a link to a handout for today's webinar. The topic is self-care, and you might find some of those resources helpful, and Deborah will be talking about that topic later in the webinar. When the webinar ends, we would ask you to take just a minute to complete a very brief survey where you can give us feedback on today's webinar and also let us know what other topics you might be interested in. Just wanted to bring a couple of things to your attention. This webinar is a part of a series that we're doing at CTAC on kinship care. There were 3 webinars already held that were really well attended and I think very valuable and appreciated by the listeners. They were done by the Kinship Navigator program. And then there's Deborah's webinar today and also a webinar in the middle of May that will be done by the Family Center of Brooklyn. So anytime you're looking to find some of our webinars, you can navigate to the CTAC webpage, and if you look up top under upcoming events and click on that tab, a calendar will come up, and you can navigate through by date, or there's a search button over a search box over to your left, and you can search by topic to find past webinars. So before we get started today, the only other thing I'd like to say is to thank Families Together in New York State. They've been our partners in developing this webinar series. And you'll hear Susan Berger's voice later on in the webinar as we handle questions. She's the Director of Workforce Development with Families Together in New York State. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Deborah. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today and be part of the series on kinship care. And I'm glad that all of you are participating. When we first started planning this webinar in January and the topic of ambiguous loss for kin caregivers seemed relevant, it was well before the COVID-19 pandemic had started. And now that that is in full effect, this seems even more timely. And I hope that what we talk about today will be of value in your work as you're going through and supporting families during this very challenging time. So the objectives for today are to first define ambiguous loss and consider how it affects kin care families, to think about how COVID-19 has generated many types of ambiguous loss for kin care families, but for families in general too, and to build awareness of the significance of cultural context when we're thinking about family and community traditions and responses. And then to think about how do we best support families who are coping with this? What are the strategies? What are some adaptive measures that can be of help? Thinking about this as a strength-based approach. And then, given the demands on us, what do we need to sustain our work and think about self-care, which sometimes seems daunting and that we don't have time for, and yet can be very sustaining, especially now. So let's start with defining what ambiguous loss is. These are real losses that can cause pain and yet are often unresolved. They're different from death. Death has finality, and ambiguous losses don't tend to have that. There's a lack of clarity and confusion, and sometimes it's not clear if they're temporary or permanent. Think, for example, if you would, about a child in kinship care or foster care the child may be separated from the parent, and that's a real loss. But they don't know, will they be reunited with the parent? Why did this happen? Did they cause it? There's a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty. And yet the connection to that parent may still be very strong and very profound, and we'll talk more about that later. Ambiguous losses can be the loss of a relationship or a connection. It can be a disruption in attachment. It can be a loss of a place or a loss of a thing. If we think about immigrant families and they're away from their countries of origin, that's a type of ambiguous loss. If you think about the loss of a job, that also falls into this category. If you think about the loss of a home for someone who's become homeless, that's another type of ambiguous loss. And with COVID-19, there's so many layers of loss. We think about safety and risk. We think about health, loss of control, for some of work. Children are without school. Families struggle without food or housing. There's the risk of being more isolated and we're not with others that we usually are. Our supports and resources aren't there. And there's a lack of stability. So all of these are types of ambiguous loss, and they can cause lots of challenging reactions without having the structure and benefit of clear rituals or responses. So ambiguous loss reactions can be ones that are more confusing and uncertain. There can be this chronic hope and disappointment cycle. For example, if there's a kin care family because a parent is substance abusing and maybe in rehab, and there's this hope and desire and yearning for the parent to be able to function and be drug-free and come back and care for them, when the desire for that is very strong, and yet when that doesn't always happen, the cycle of hope and disappointment continues. And then children and caregivers can have very strong reactions to that being disrupted. I also want to say just a word about parents and kinship care families, which is that many times the comments I hear, parents become kind of demonized in this process rather than they're struggling too and may not have access or motivation or knowledge of what the resources and supports can be to help them with whatever they're struggling with. So just to kind of hold that. There's the sense of wishing and yearning, the idea for children in kin care to be reunited, or what happens when a family member is deported or incarcerated, that the desire for reconnection is still there. And then there can be feelings of betrayal because of the perceived abandonment. Sometimes reactions aren't understood as a result of ambiguous loss, and there's great value as we're working with children and families to find out what's their history of ambiguous loss. Can we evaluate that and think about how it might be affecting a child's behavior, their relationships, their learning, perhaps their somatizing and their social responses. Sometimes we see children when they have occasional contact with the absent parent or they learn new information, having very strong reactions. Imagine what it's like for a child when they discover that their mother, who's not with them, actually has another family and she's raising other children. And how did the primary child, in this case, understand why that parent has made that choice? And there are maybe many ambivalent and mixed feelings about what these losses mean and the nature of those attachments. When I'm working with clients and they may be describing someone who they have had a difficult relationship with, who hasn't been there for them, who they felt abandoned by, and they're angry and hurt and upset, but also confused because the power of that connection and that caring for that person is still very much there. And clients have looked at me in shock when I've said, that you can have these conflicting feelings side by side, even if they don't always make sense. And the relief that appears on clients' faces when we can talk about this often gives them some greater understanding and capacity to sort through the complex feelings. One of the exercises we sometimes do that we've used in the Kinship Care Program and the Children's Loss and Bereavement Program that I directed, for many years, is this drawing of tangle of emotions, that all of these mixed feelings or some of these mixed feelings can all be in this one place. And sometimes children color in the feelings that reflect, what is true for them, or they add their own, and this can be done with adults as well. Just a quick example of one way of making this visual for clients. So let's talk a little more specifically about kin care families and how ambiguous losses affect them. Wanted just to make sure we're kind of on the same page about what kin care is. These are families where relatives, most frequently grandparents, but can be great-grands, aunts and uncles, cousins, and sometimes what we call fictive kin, those who are very close to the family but may not be blood relatives. And more recently, we've been seeing older siblings raising younger siblings. These are considered kin caregivers, and they have the full-time responsibility of raising children. Across the U.S., there are almost 6 million children being raised by relatives right now. And the relatives' ages range from in their 20s, sometimes into their late 80s, early 90s. The average age tends to cluster around mid-50s. These are considered viable and permanent options for children. They're with family. They are often in environments that they're familiar with. There are many, many advantages to being raised by relatives. Most of the families that we've worked with over the years are not in the child welfare system, but some are. Those that are have been there as a result of abuse or neglect or safety issues. But many families opt not to go through the child welfare, child protective services, and do this independently. And in doing that, our caregivers are making tremendous sacrifices, but really want to make sure that the children stay with them and are raised, by family. So for kin care families, they are often coping with many, many different types of losses, and many have multiple losses. So there may be separations and abandonments. There's loss of dreams and hopes and ideals. When we talk to caregivers about what they had hoped for their child, the parent in the situation, many talk about how they thought that their child would be, having a stable life and functioning well and being able to, fulfill their education and their goals. And many times that's not what's happened in these situations. And the disappointment and the sadness that comes and frustration is often very, very prevalent. Families, children have been exposed to abuse and violence. Many have had trauma. And one of the things I always like to emphasize is that in many families, there's an intergenerational transmission of trauma, in that the caregiver themselves may have had traumatic exposure to difficult things in their life that may have gone unrecognized and untreated. And in turn, their own children may have had traumatic issues, traumatic events, and now the children are. And one of the reasons we want to get a sense of this is how can we best intervene and think about what's needed to break this cycle so that more generations are not being exposed to trauma or can get the support and help that they need. Anticipatory loss is another type of loss that we're considering, and that may be where someone is terminally ill and there's a period of preparation and time as the death approaches. Some of our families are affected by death from overdose or from chronic or terminal illness. These can be traumatic or complicated. And then there's what we call stigmatized losses, which have to do with those associated with shame or guilt. And then today we will be focusing on ambiguous loss specifically. Children live with relatives for a variety of reasons. I've ranked these from highest to lowest in terms of what we know from research about most prevalent. Substance abuse is the highest, especially given the opioid epidemic, drugs and alcohol. And you can see the others as they go through. There's often an overlap of issues and comorbidity that they may be connected. Think, for example, about a parent who may be struggling with mental health issues and then turns to substances as a way to try to cope with those, and then as a result of that commits a crime and is in jail. So there is overlap among all of these, and most of these are also forms of ambiguous loss. So if we look to research for a moment, Pauline Boss in the 1999 wrote the landmark book on ambiguous loss, also has the same name, and she proposed two constructs, and I think these are really helpful in organizing our thinking about ambiguous loss. She described where the relationship with the person is one where they are physically absent but psychologically present. So let's start with that. So for examples for kin care families, it could be parental incarceration. It could be kin care foster care placement, parental substance abuse, deportation, and separation from siblings. So even though the family member, the person who the child's connected to, is not physically present, they're psychologically very much there for the child or for the caregiver, that the connection remains very strong, even in the absence of their being there in body physically. We're seeing more frequently that although attempts are made not to, that separation from siblings can have, of course, a very profound effect on children. And the connections to those siblings remain very strong even when they're not present. And the other construct is the flip side, the reverse of this, where someone may be physically present but psychologically absent. So if someone has dementia, they may be there in body but not connecting cognitively or emotionally. When someone has chronic medical or mental health challenges or disabilities, when a caregiver, it might be using substances, or a caregiver is so overwhelmed by all the multiple responsibilities that they now have in raising relative children that they are physically there but not attuned to what the child needs. And these are important constructs because thinking about it in this way and giving a name to ambiguous loss gives it recognition. Sometimes if we think if we can name it, we can then learn to manage it. It's not so vague. It's not so unclear. So this is a quote from Markel's book that although grief is still present and ongoing, ambiguous loss occurs when a relationship isn't recognized or acknowledged, when the loss isn't recognized, or the griever isn't perceived as one with permission to grieve. So I'd like just to pose a question, and if you would put your response in the chat box and reply to all panelists. We'll see if we can see how these cluster. But I was wondering, what types of ambiguous loss are you seeing the most often? Which types of these are you seeing the most often? In the work that you're doing with your clients or in today's world? But if you would chat those into the box and respond to all panelists, then we can take a look at that. And I'll continue while that's going on. So ambiguous loss can have shame and guilt associated with it. Families may not want to share where the parent is or what's happened with them, especially if they're incarcerated. Um, there may be shame and guilt for both the caregiver and the children, being worried that they caused this to happen, and can this be talked about? And is it okay to share the fears and the worries and all the different feelings about it? Many times, issues of ambiguous loss go underground and families keep secrets. There are lots of mixed feelings. There's the sense, we're going back to Pauline Boss's work, that someone is here but not here, and hard to know if it's safe to have dreams and hopes. With ambiguous loss, we don't have the usual rituals that bring comfort, and there can be, the primary loss and then secondary losses as a result. And we want to think about this in the cultural context of the family and the community. And so to think for a minute about cultural beliefs, these are really very important and meaningful, and I think we need to make sure we're building this into our work with our clients. Is there a language of loss when it's ambiguous? Is there a way to reference what's happened? Is it acceptable to tell others about what's happened and where the missing person is? I've heard stories of caregivers who said to children, because they didn't want to upset or worry them about their parent who was incarcerated, but to say, oh, they're off in college. Or one family, unfortunately, where the children were told that the parent was out shopping, which didn't hold very well as the weeks went on and the parent didn't return from this extended shopping spree. The question of how is there closure, because without those usual rituals and customs, can new ones be created? We might not have a funeral for someone with ambiguous loss, but are there ways to remember the person who's gone, or to cherish what was important, or to even accept their limitations? And is it okay to grieve? And of course, these types of losses cause a great deal of mourning and grief reactions. And in a culture, is it okay to forgive for what someone's done? Is it okay to have some acceptance that my mother couldn't raise me, or my father was unable to, and how much of that is tolerable and acceptable? In some families, there's the idea of stigmatized and loss and family secrets. Many times our caregivers want to be protective of children and not tell them much about what's going on with the parent. In this, the challenge is that children tend to have very sharp antennae. They pick things up so quickly, and when they don't have some sense of what's going on, their own fears and fantasies may be actually worse than reality. And we'll talk a little later about how can you talk to children, and and thinking about this developmentally, and what's age appropriate. So we want to, when we're working with families too, I think we need to understand what the hesitation, what the reasons are for not explaining things to children, and to start with where the caregiver is at and their level of comfort and their level of tolerance. For children, they have many complex issues. One of the things I've been hearing recently is that children are afraid that their caregiver, especially if they have medical conditions or are infirmed or elderly, might actually die from the virus, and what would happen to them. And these are really tough discussions and conversations to have. Very hard to deal with what it would mean around mortality and who would care for the children. But what's essential is creating a safety plan and setting up what would happen so that the child will know that they will always have someone to care for them. And that this can be done by creating standby guardianship orders, or through a caregiver's will, and also communicating to the child what the plan would be. For children, they're coping with what it means that their parent is absent, and they may have been exposed or directly received abuse, neglect, violence, and exposure to trauma. As a result, what we see is that they can feel very capsized, upset, and derailed. Their behavior can be disruptive. Their feelings can be dysregulated, where they're very amped up or very shut down. Their thinking becomes confused. And what happens often is that they can be diagnosed with ADHD or ADD, with oppositional defiant disorder, with post-traumatic stress disorder, with adjustment and attachment disorders. And again, with these types of situations, we want to do a careful assessment before diagnosing, because if we understand that these reactions are not from children wanting to be oppositional or wanting to be difficult, but they're coming because of the responses to ambiguous loss, then that allows us to treat and intervene more effectively and more directly, and these then need to be recognized in that way. For caregivers, the challenge often is how do they attend to their own responses about loss and their own grieving when they're raising their relative children. They may be finding adaptive ways of coping. They may also just kind of say, I have to keep a stiff upper lip, I've got to get through this, I don't have time to grieve. Our caregivers may be wonderful about raising the children that they do, but often put their own needs on hold, and they need an opportunity to focus on their own grief so that they can best support children to do this. Some are afraid if they start to talk or grieve, this will open up the floodgates and there won't be any way to stop that process. And then occasionally we see complicated coping, such as substance abuse. I was working with a family, and a grandmother was managing an infant, a teenager, and a young teenager, an older teenager, and living in poverty and very overwhelmed. And she had lots of medical issues and was quite elderly. And at one point, as we were talking, I said, Ms. So-and-so, how are you managing all of this? This seems like a tremendous amount to be able to maintain and to focus on the children. And she said, well, the days are tough. She said, there's a lot going on. I have to be on my toes all the time. I have more than I can possibly do. I don't have enough help and support. I don't know what's out there to make a difference. But she said, at night when the kids are in bed and things are quiet, she said, that's when I take care of myself. And I said, no, what do you do then? And she said, I bring out the bottle of vodka, and we're real good friends for a good part of that night. And, most of it, half of it may be gone by the morning, but that's how I cope. So it was obviously time to speak about what could be done to consider what else might be helpful in the situation and how to get her some treatment for alcoholism at that point. Okay. So there may be a number of things that interfere with coping. There is some of these I think we've discussed actually, so I'm going to skip through some of it. But the support network may not know how to respond, may not know that a loss has occurred, and may not know how to validate the loss. So let's move to intervention at this point. I think hopefully we've covered enough about concepts and aspects of ambiguous loss. I like to think about the 3 C's when I think about intervention: communication, consistency, and competency. So communication, for most of us, we find that we do better when we have information. We think about what's happened with COVID-19 and how, we need information in order to cope. We need to know what's safe and what isn't, and how hopefully, when this will at some point end and when things will ease. And for children, they need this very much as well. It reduces the uncertainty and the vagueness. And I think that what research shows us is they do better when they know a little bit, and that's age appropriate and in small doses. Some caregivers don't know how to talk about the issues around ambiguous loss because they're complex and vague. So can we work with a caregiver? Can we model that? Can we practice it with them so that they can find ways to put things into words for children? It might be something like this, which could be caregivers saying to the children, something sad happened today. Even though we hoped your mom would be coming out of rehab, it's going to take longer than we expected. And it's okay to have a lot of feelings about this. I do. but we're going to find ways to get through this together. Just a way to start the conversation. And usually you can do this over time in small doses and keeping the conversation open. Excuse me. The next C is consistency. When the world turns upside down and everything's different, whether it's COVID or a child coming out of their parents' home and coming to caregivers' homes, we need predictability and structure. And we know kids do, as most of us do, much better when we have structure and routines. And competency refers to the idea of we may be working with families for days or weeks or months or sometimes years, but we're probably not going to be there for the entire time that they're raising their relative children. So can we emphasize their strengths? Can we talk about what they're doing well? Can we help them overcome challenges and struggles so that when we're no longer in the picture, that they can competently help their relative children at that point? Children are very good at asking a lot of questions, and this next slide addresses some of those. Caregivers may not be able to always answer all of these, but certainly misconceptions can be clarified that, whatever happened was not their fault, and that we can give explanation for why sometimes, but not always. And it's okay to say, we don't know. We'll try to figure this out. So what helps children? The idea of giving them an explanation that maybe with psychoeducation that helps give the kind of psychological perspective. How do we give caregivers tools? And we'll talk about some of those in a moment. Children can be talked to about circumstances of what's happening to their parent or about ambiguous loss. And a beginning conversation that can be built upon over years. The foundation starts when they're younger, and more can be added as they can process more cognitively and process more emotionally. But we want to make sure that we have opportunities for caregivers to express and focus on their own feelings so that they can feel ready to help the child. And we want to use age-appropriate language. Younger children are very concrete and take things very literally. Older children can understand abstract and vagueness more easily. And to do this in a cultural context, often books and stories are really useful, and there are many good ones around being in foster care or around incarceration or dealing with substance issues. And expressive arts is something we've used often in our programs. They're often safer means of expression, and for children who may not always have the words to describe what they're feeling, using the arts, drawing, writing, photographing, using music can make a tremendous difference and allows us to get a better sense of what's happening internally for them. These are some of the tools, the expressive art activities we've used. Basket of Words is a little bit like the refrigerator magnets, where you ask someone to pull 6 or 8 words out randomly and to write something about their loss, incorporating those words into a phrase or a sentence or a paragraph. A 6-word story is asking if you could just have 6 words, what would you say about the ambiguous losses that you're dealing with? And one child wrote, once here, now gone, I'm strong. And these are their terms, their words. Sometimes creating a memory box or a book to create and decorate a box and put special mementos or items that help the child feel connected or the caregiver connected to the parent, or creating a book about their life together or what they wish for or hope for. The letter to a missing person might be to help them write about what their life is like now, or if they miss the person who's gone. Doing a timeline and put hash marks along the line to indicate what happened when helps organize. Journaling is wonderful, bibliotherapy, books, and there are some book lists that we can share, which I will get to CTAC staff for you. Making a collage is wonderful, and one of the advantages of collage is that like with trauma that can feel very disorganizing, with collage you can take lots of disparate pieces and put it together and create a whole. and these can promote the idea of creating a narrative. And music has an incredible appeal when you think about lyrics that speak to so many types of ambiguous loss that families are experiencing, and can help universalize the experience. One of the other activities we do is called the intention bead activity, and there's some variations on this, but by taking a small piece of paper and rolling it around a stick, creating a bead, children can make a necklace or a bracelet. But before they roll, they can write on the piece of paper, what is it they wish or yearn for? Do they wish for the parent to come back? Do they wish for the parent to stop using drugs? Do they wish that their grandmother gets more money to be able to take care of them, because many of our families are living in poverty? And then they can roll them up, and it can be something they keep for themselves. So these are important points that are now coming up about what can help. A starting place is to name and acknowledge the loss, which gives it recognition. Since these are vague and unclear and uncertain losses, when we know what it is, and that gives us a good place to begin these conversations and to begin to understand some of the impact and the tremendous reach these losses have. We can talk about what's been lost, stability, a neighborhood, a school, and what's still the same, what provides consistency, and to think about what keeps children safe and stable. Can a caregiver attend to themselves and do what they need to first in order to provide that for the child? What resources are in the community to help? Where can they turn? There are many excellent programs throughout the country. Many are state funded, some are through private foundations. There are support groups, and there's individual counseling, and there's case management and advocacy and legal support, and housing help. And so there are many types of programs out there, and can we serve as the link to help connect families to those? Families need consistency, and are there ways to understand the situation so that the guilt and shame can be reduced? That this was not within the child's control, and this is something that is, a larger pandemic or a larger societal issue that a parent is struggling with. In addition, I think it's really helpful when we can label and normalize ambivalent and contradictory feelings, as we talked about earlier, to pay very careful attention and honor cultural perspectives, what's tolerated, what isn't, what's supported within the culture, where are the sources of support within a culture, who can they turn to safely to talk to about these issues. And if the old family traditions aren't working, can new ones be created? And can we think about adaptive coping measures? And we'll talk a little more later. We can talk about, what supports are in the community, and also what supports does someone have internally. And then the idea of making meaning is, how do we understand? How do we try to frame what's happened so that this gives us a context in that? Okay. Individual counseling and therapy can be very useful, but in some cultures, this is not considered acceptable. And so the idea of groups can be often a very natural forming way to respond. We can provide clients with a way to feel less alone. Many of our clients talk about feeling so isolated when they're coping with these kinds of losses. And peer support is there, and a sense of universality. Many times there can be an acceptance and normalizing of the reactions to ambiguous loss. And groups can be a safe place to bring up taboo topics. One of the grandmothers I worked with said, after coming to a group for a while, she said, this is the only place in my entire life where I can not be judged, because others have gone through this and others helped me through this. And I don't need to worry about anything that I've done or be rejected for that. And she said that that's what makes me get up in the morning. I think many times when peers are going through similar things as us, that the connection is very powerful. And it also is a place where lots of feelings can be expressed, and so there can be greater acceptance of that. If a group's facilitated, then there can be a psychoeducational focus, and I think it can help somewhat in the grieving process about holding on and letting go. Okay, so to talk now about self-care, because our work is demanding and a lot is expected of us, and as with caregivers needing to take care of themselves for raising children, it's important that we do the same. And so self-care can be across many domains. It can be our feelings, our mind, body, work, relationships, and spiritual beliefs. I like to turn to poetry because I've been trained as a poetry therapist. And so in this idea that sometimes the value of our work may go unrecognized and more is demanded of us, there's a beautiful poem by Jane Hirschfield called The Weighing, and in it she says, "The world asks of us only the strength we have, and we give it, and then it asks for more, and we give it. But the risk with this is that we get depleted, and then there's not much left." When we're stressed, it can affect all of those same domains that we just talked about, and the challenge then becomes, how do we take care of ourselves? We can't pour very much from an empty cup. So if we take care of ourselves first, often that can make a nice difference. There are lots of misconceptions about self-care, and sometimes things come up like it means I'm being selfish or self-indulgent. Who has time for self-care? Not me. I don't even have time for lunch. This is too onerous to even consider. It just takes too long. So even though we talk the talk, we may not always get to it. Remember, too, about self-care that it can be really short. Just remembering to take a couple of really good deep breaths, or to go out and get some fresh air for 5 minutes, that these things can matter tremendously and can help stabilize and center and ground us. The handout, I think, will be available that has lots and lots of suggestions for self-care. One of my favorites on there is to think of or to write 4 things that you're grateful for and 4 things that you'd like the universe to hold for you. Are there things that are just too big or too hard that we need to just set aside for a little while so we can focus on what we need to do in front of us? And then when we're ready, we can ask for those things to come back. This nice graphic shows some other options for self-care. And I'd like to ask that you each consider a self-care plan so that we're not running on fumes and that you can replenish and refuel. And to see if you can come up with 2 things each week you can do for self-care. And to think about the following questions as you do that. Good to have a self-care buddy, so you check in with each other and can find out if you've stuck to your self-care plan, and if not, what would make it better to do. But often that can make it a nice difference. And then to think about resiliency and protective factors. The idea of where do we get compassion, satisfaction in our work? How can we expand or connect to our support networks? Thinking about our strengths and what we do well and what our energy management is. How do we get heard and validated? There's the idea of, instead of being a vessel where we take everything and hold it in, we can be a container, which means it comes in, but it flows out. And can we think about that part of it in order to give ourselves more stability? What coping strategies have helped before, and if not, if we don't have enough, what are some new approaches? And what are our limits and our personal issues? What do we need in order to keep going and to instill hope and take steps to protect ourselves and refuel? The ultimate goal is a balanced life with time for work, relationships, relaxation, and fun, and the resilience to hold up under pressure and meet challenges. And I'd like to close with a final poem. This is called Airplanes of the Heart, and it's by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Airplanes of the heart, the little airplanes of the heart, with their brave little propellers, What can they do against the winds of darkness, even as butterflies are beaten back by hurricanes, yet do not die? They lie in wait wherever they can hide and hang, their fine wings folded, and when the killer wind dies, they flutter forth again into the new blown light, live as leaves. So thank you, and I'm going to close there, and I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much for that, all that very interesting information, and also for the poems. So I'm going to remind everybody that you can just chat in your questions to the chat box, and we'll be able to collect them and then present them. In the meantime, while you guys are thinking of questions and typing them in, I'm going to take a minute to review some of the responses that you all put up for the poll. There are a lot of responses, and as you can imagine, some of them, there are a lot of people who have been experiencing working with families that have the same kinds of ambiguous loss. So I'm going to read through a couple of them. Anticipating a lot of this after the current situation, with people unable to attend funeral services as they normally would, and that kids and adults are feeling a sense of ambiguous loss and lack of closure. So that's one thing that people are seeing. In terms of ambiguous loss, deportation, a lot of you reflected back housing, families who are separated by COVID-19, just even in their own communities. Working with immigrants, a big loss is family members remaining in their countries of origin. Incarceration, many of you reported, drugs and domestic violence. Loss of income, loss of job, which leads to a loss of security, and especially in COVID-19, a loss of normalcy. Everything is different now. And there's this feeling of not quite knowing when it's going to go back to normal and what that new normal might be. Financial struggles due to COVID-19, parents with mental illness, a loss of freedom, which is something that's heightened in the time we're living in right now. Loss related to not being in school right now. And that goes, I guess, all the way from preschool up. And that's a loss for the children and also a loss for the caregivers. Where long-term relationships are ending and a disconnect between a parent and child. Mothers who have been struggling to get out of domestic violence situations, and frequent relationship attachment ruptures, loss of routines due to placement, and loss of biological family contact. Several families, someone says several families I have worked with have prolonged visitation with biological parents until rights have been terminated. And people being alone in the U.S. with no support or family and feeling incredibly lonely, especially during this time. So that's sort of a synopsis of all of the different responses that you chatted in. So thank you so much for that. I see we do have a couple of questions here, so I'm going to start with one that's actually already been answered. Somebody asked if there'd be an opportunity for the presenter to share a reading list with attendees, and Deborah answered that and said that she would send something along to the folks at CTAC, and that they would then be able to send it out to you. So I'm going to start with one of the questions. I have a client that has no contact with his father and knows nothing about him. He wants to know more about him and why he isn't around, and the client's 12. Do you think it could be helpful or harmful in his moving on?
Really important question, and that's such a pivotal and critical age where 12-year-olds are trying to think about their own identity and where they came from and where they're going moving forward. It would be hard to answer that question without knowing a little more about the situation, about is there any greater information about why the parent isn't there and what the nature of the relationship was earlier. Or if that's not known, can the 12-year-old simply be told that sometimes parents aren't able to parent well, and it doesn't always feel very good to know that, but that they are absent could be for a variety of reasons, and to really affirm that the 12-year-old's questions are good and important in trying to figure out where he came from and what the meaning of this is for that child, preteen. But I think even if there aren't clear answers, to validate the importance of those questions and to give some frame for why it is that parents are absent sometimes and not able to parent well, and to acknowledge that there's a tremendous loss and grief attached to that too, and trying to figure that out. I think if there's more information known about why that parent isn't there, then that could be approached a little more specifically. But I hope that gives some general guidelines.
Thank you. So the next question is, can you say a little bit more about the special challenges faced by families separated through deportation?
Sure. Such an important question. And if a parent is, it obviously depends a bit on the circumstances of the deportation, but if a parent is deported and a child stays here and maybe living then with relatives, the circumstances of how that parent was deported. We've heard from children that ICE or federal agents have come to a home and removed the parent in front of them, and it was not handled in a way where there was any preparation, any warning, and became incredibly traumatizing. And so what does the child need then to process that experience? And the immediate fears of, if it happened to my parent, is it going to happen to me? Am I safe? Where did my parent go? And will I be able to be with them? And why can't I be in touch with them? And why did this happen? And if a child doesn't know what the circumstances were that caused the deportation, which aren't always talked about, what can be explained to them about how the system works and all of the challenges and struggles and problems and issues with it as a result. And then to be able to talk about what are they going to do to cope during this time until more information is gained, or they hope at some point for reunification if that's possible, but that the caregiver is going to do everything they can to keep the child safe and secure and keep things as stable as possible. And again, no guarantees because we just don't know sometimes, but just speaking to the issues of abandonment and that huge disruption in attachment and the ensuing very powerful fears and worries for the child about what does this mean.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure.
So the next question is, you spoke on children's fears of losing a parent to the virus. What is the best way to address children's fears when the parent works in a hospital and it is spoken about in the home? So, the child hears about it.
Sure. Really good question and very timely. And some of that also depends on the age of the child. The older a child is, the more aware they may be, and they may be learning a lot from the news and social media, and hearing some of the very scary stories that are out there. I think you want to be as realistic without being too overwhelming, and talk about, yes, there are risks, but that your parent is committed to doing everything they can to keep people well cared for and their needs being met in this medical crisis. And there are risks, but here are the things that your mom or dad or caregiver is doing in order to try to mitigate those risks, and all the things they're doing, like when they get home, they shed everything and go into the shower and they wash their hands, and they're doing their best to wear masks and PPE and do all the things that can be helpful. And in those situations, when there's anxiety and there's stress and depression and worry, helping a child go from passive to active can be enormously helpful. So in the passive part is the worry and the helplessness and the fear. But are there some things that the child can do to feel empowered to respond to this, so that they feel that they're in support with what the parent is doing? Can they help to get food donations and donate food? Can they design a new type of mask? Can they go into the community when it's safe? Or are there specific things that can be done so that the child has an opportunity to contribute? Because in many ways, a parent is modeling that. But at the same time, how do you help contain and refocus some of the anxiety through information and through validation, and through talking about the feelings that are associated, and then what's being done to protect?
Thank you.
Sure.
And then looks like we'll have time for maybe one or two more questions. So I'm going to go with this question, which is, what are some special considerations for working with kinship caregivers who are elderly and struggling addressing and managing children's challenging behaviors?
Really good question. And it's something that our caregivers talk about a lot, especially for teenagers, where they feel that there's just so much that's beyond their control. I think one of the first things that can be really useful is reaching out and getting some support and guidance, so that they're not feeling so isolated in this, and trying to understand why the teenager or the child is acting in this way, and also giving them a frame, because I think the more attuned and empathy that a caregiver can have towards the child, the more they'll be able to mobilize and think about how to best respond. Kids are remarkably good at pushing our buttons sometimes, and this can get really overwhelming for a caregiver who feels out of step with our generation and technology and computers and acting out behavior and disruptive behavior. So are there ways that we can give space for a caregiver to talk about the struggles and the difficulties in helping in addressing these issues, and also get relief for them? And does a difficult child need to be in therapy, and does there need to be some family counseling or some support group work that could really ease some of the struggle in this way?
Thank you so much for the questions, and then also for the answers. We don't have time for any more questions, so I am going to pass the baton back over to Ann Cuppinger, who's going to close out the webinar.
Thank you, Susan. So many good questions, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. We will post these slides and the recording to our website, along with the handout and the reading list that Deborah so graciously offered to put together for everyone. I want to just show you a couple of other things here. Anyone who has specific questions related to service delivery during COVID-19, there's a link to our website, there's a page where we've tried to post all recent updates and policy changes from OMH. This is a list of a few upcoming webinars, and I'd like to especially point out this last one, which is the last in our Kinship Care series. We are also putting together a couple of webinars. We don't have the actual dates yet on grief and loss. So keep an eye out for those and maybe sign up for our digest and our listserv so you'll get notification about those, because I suspect based on the feedback that we're seeing that there'll be a lot of interest in that. This is Deborah's contact information. And Dr. Langosh, I just want to thank you so much for all the wisdom you brought to today's webinar. It just strikes me how, although the topic here was on kinship families and ambiguous loss, how relevant this is to the work that everyone is doing with all kids and families in this time, and also just in general, given the number of needs that are out there that and the trauma that children and families are experiencing. So I thank you very much for leaving us with some practical strategies to support ourselves and other people. I think we need that optimism during this time. And with that, I'll wrap up, and thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Chair.